The silence in Arthur Penhaligon's garage was a physical weight. It was a thick, stagnant quiet, broken only by the drip of a leaky faucet into a rust-stained bucket and the mournful whistle of wind through a cracked windowpane. The air, heavy with the ghosts of gasoline, old oil and cold iron, no longer carried the promise of work. It smelled of decay, of a business slowly bleeding out. Dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light that slanted through the grimy windows, illuminating the graveyard of forgotten projects and the empty bays that should have been humming with activity. Arthur stood in the center of the cavernous space, his hands, stained with a lifetime of grease that no soap could ever fully conquer, hanging limp at his sides. His shoulders were stooped, not just from the 58 years of bending over engines, but from a weariness that had settled deep in his bones. He ran a hand over his thinning gray hair, his gaze sweeping over the tools that hung in perfect, orderly rows on the pegboard walls. Wrenches polished by use, sockets arranged by size, screwdrivers with handles worn smooth to the shape of his palm. They were more than tools. They were extensions of himself, loyal and dependable in a world that had become anything but. The phone on the wall, a rotary model from a bygone era, hadn't rung for a customer in 3 days. Its silence was louder than any engine, a constant, nagging reminder of his failure. The town of Havenwood, once a place where his father's name and then his own had meant something, had moved on. Sleek, corporate auto shops with their clean lobbies, free coffee, and fast, impersonal service had sprung up on the highway, siphoning away his regulars one by one. They didn't fix things anymore. They replaced them. Arthur fixed things. It was all he knew how to do. He looked at the final demand notice lying on his workbench, its stark red letters a slash of violence against the cluttered but organized surface. Foreclosure, it screamed. The word felt like a punch to the gut, stealing the air from his lungs. 30 days. 30 days to come up with an amount of money that seemed as astronomical as the distance to the moon. He had inherited this garage, Penhaligon and Son, from his father, who had inherited it from his. The sign above the wide, roll-up doors was faded and peeling, but the words were a testament to a legacy he was about to lose. He felt the sting of shame, a hot, acrid burn behind his eyes. He had not just failed himself. He had failed the generations before him. His gaze drifted to a small, framed photograph tucked between a jar of bolts and a can of penetrating oil. A smiling boy with his own toothy grin, sitting proudly on a small dirt bike. Michael. The name was a whisper in his heart, a constant, dull ache. The boy who had loved the smell of motor oil and the roar of an engine. The son who should have been here, his laughter filling the silent space. But Michael was gone, taken by a war in a distant desert 15 years ago, leaving behind only memories and a profound, cavernous emptiness that Arthur had tried to fill with work. Now even the work was gone. The sharp, arrogant honk of a car horn shattered the oppressive quiet. A gleaming black sedan, a luxury model that looked utterly alien against the backdrop of crumbling asphalt and weathered brick, had pulled up, blocking the entrance to his drive. Arthur watched as Mr. Sterling unfolded himself from the driver's seat. He was a man made of sharp angles and expensive fabric, his suit immaculate, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Sterling was his landlord, the owner of the entire block, a man who had inherited wealth the way Arthur had inherited tools, but with none of the accompanying sense of duty or care. Sterling's lip curled in a faint sneer as he surveyed the garage, his eyes lingering on the peeling paint and the cracked concrete. "Penhaligon," he said, his voice smooth but laced with disdain. He didn't approach, preferring to stand by his pristine car as if proximity to the garage might soil him. "I trust you received my correspondence." Arthur's hands curled into fists in his pockets. He forced them to relax, smoothing his palms against the rough denim of his jeans. "I got the notice, Sterling." "Good. Then you understand the gravity of the situation." Sterling adjusted his silk tie, a small, smug gesture. "Frankly, Arthur, this is an embarrassment, an eyesore. This property is in a prime redevelopment zone, and your establishment is dragging down the value for everyone. Arthur's jaw tightened. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples. He had known Sterling since they were boys. Sterling had been the one with new bicycles and expensive toys, the one who mocked Arthur's second-hand clothes. Some things, it seemed, never changed. "This garage has been here for 70 years, Arthur said, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "It's a part of this town." Sterling chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "History doesn't pay the bills, Arthur. Progress does. A boutique hotel, perhaps. A high-end bistro. Something that attracts money, not rust." He took a step forward, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. He gestured vaguely at the garage's interior. "Look at this place. It's a relic. You're a relic. The world has moved on. It's time you did, too." The word relic struck a nerve, sharp and painful. It was what he saw in the mirror every morning. A man out of time, clinging to a code of craftsmanship and honor that the world had discarded like a worn-out part. He thought of his father's words, spoken in this very garage decades ago. "A man's worth is in his hands and his word." What was his word worth now, when he couldn't even pay his rent? Sterling pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and delicately wiped a speck of dust from his sleeve. "I'm giving you an opportunity, out of the goodness of my heart. Vacate in 2 weeks and I'll forgive the back rent. Clean break. Otherwise, I'll see you in court, and I assure you I will take everything. The tools, the sign, what little dignity you have left." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp as a winter morning. The mention of his tools, his father's tools, was a deliberate cruelty. Sterling knew what they meant to him. It was a calculated move to break his spirit. Arthur looked past Sterling at the town beyond. He saw Mrs. Gable from the bakery hurry by, her eyes fixed firmly on the pavement. He saw young Mr. Henderson from the new insurance office slow his car, stare for a moment with undisguised pity, and then speed away. No one intervened. No one offered a word of support. They were all just spectators to his slow, public demolition. He felt a profound sense of isolation, as if he were on a tiny, crumbling island with the tide rolling in. "I'll have your money," Arthur said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It was a lie, a desperate, pathetic bluff, but it was all he had. Sterling's smile was predatory. "I highly doubt that," he purred. "But by all means try. It will be amusing to watch." He turned, slid back into his silent, opulent car, and drove away, leaving behind only the scent of expensive leather and the suffocating weight of his ultimatum. Arthur didn't move for a long time. He stood there, a statue of grease and denim, watching the dust settle where Sterling's car had been. The man's words echoed in the empty space, chipping away at the foundation of his identity. A relic, an eyesore. He felt a familiar hollowness spread through his chest, the same one that had taken root the day the two soldiers had appeared on his doorstep, their faces grim, their uniforms immaculate. They had spoken of courage, of sacrifice, of his son Michael's heroism. But all Arthur heard was the silence that followed. Michael was gone. His wife, Eleanor, had faded soon after, a flower deprived of its sun, succumbing to a sickness that the doctors said was pneumonia but Arthur knew was a broken heart. He was alone. The garage became his sanctuary, the only place where the ghosts felt less like accusers and more like quiet companions. He found solace in the logic of machines, the certainty that if you followed the steps, identified the problem, and applied the right solution, things could be made whole again. It was a comforting lie in a life that had been irrevocably broken. He walked over to his workbench, his fingers tracing the gouges and scars in the thick wood. Each mark told a story. The deep scratch from a slipped wrench while rebuilding the engine on his first car. The burn mark from a soldering iron when he and Michael had spent a whole weekend fixing a vintage radio. He picked up the framed photo of his son. Michael, age 12, grinning from ear to ear, a smudge of grease on his nose. He'd had a natural talent for it, a feel for the machines. He could diagnose an engine's ailment just by its sound, a gift he'd inherited from his grandfather. They had planned to change the sign one day. Penhaligon and Sons, the plural, was Eleanor's idea, a hopeful prayer for a future filled with grandchildren. After Michael's death, the dream had soured. The sign remained a painful reminder of what could have been. His promise to Eleanor on her deathbed had been simple. "I'll keep the garage going, Ellie." For him, "I'll keep the doors open." He had meant it as a vow to honor their son's memory, to maintain the one place where Michael had been truly happy. But now, keeping that promise felt like an impossible burden. The world Sterling represented, the world of disposable goods and ruthless efficiency, had no place for a man who believed in fixing things. His principles felt like antique currency, valuable only to him. He remembered a customer from a few months back, a wealthy woman in a brand-new SUV. A warning light had come on. He'd found a loose sensor, a 5-minute fix. He charged her $10. She had looked at him with suspicion. "That's it?" she'd asked. "The dealership would have charged me $200 and kept it all day." He had just shrugged. The dealership would have replaced the whole assembly. All it needed was tightening. She had paid. But she never came back. His honesty had been interpreted as a lack of sophistication, perhaps even incompetence. People didn't trust what they couldn't understand, and in this new world, no one understood a fair price. He was a dinosaur waiting for the meteor. The days that followed were a slow, grinding torment. The foreclosure notice on his workbench seemed to radiate a cold dread, a constant, physical presence in the garage. Each morning, Arthur would wake before dawn, the weight of the 30-day deadline pressing down on him. He would open the large roll-up doors with a groan of protesting metal, hoping against hope to see a customer waiting. But the driveway remained empty. The silence grew deeper, more profound. The town of Havenwood seemed to hold its breath around him. People he had known his whole life now averted their eyes when he walked to the corner store for his meager groceries. He saw the pity in their expressions, the awkward shuffle to avoid conversation. They knew about Sterling. They knew the garage was dying. Their silence was a verdict. He was a ghost in his own town, a walking memory that people were already trying to forget. One afternoon, he stood at the counter of the general store, his heart sinking as the total for a loaf of bread, a can of beans, and a small block of cheese came up on the register. He was short by $2. The humiliation was a hot flush that crept up his neck. He started to put the cheese back, his hand trembling slightly. I guess I don't need this today," he mumbled, not meeting the cashier's eyes. Behind him in line, he heard a sigh of impatience. It was Henderson, the young insurance agent. Arthur didn't have to look to know the expression on his face. He felt the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment. He was no longer Arthur Penhaligon, the master mechanic. He was the old man who couldn't afford cheese. The pressure was more than financial. It was an erosion of his soul. Every creak of the old building sounded like a death rattle. He found himself wandering through the garage, touching his tools, running his hand over the cold steel of a vintage Indian Chief motorcycle he'd been restoring for years, a personal project that had been his one indulgence. Its frame was now coated in a fine layer of dust, another dream left to tarnish. He considered selling it, but the thought felt like another betrayal, like selling off a piece of his own history. One evening, he sat on a stool, the garage dark except for a single bare bulb hanging over his workbench. He held Michael's photograph, the glass cool against his calloused thumb. The grief, usually a dull, manageable ache, was sharp and overwhelming. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered into the cavernous dark. "I'm trying. I'm tired." He felt the burn of unshed tears but refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't fix the transmission on a Ford F-150, and it wouldn't pay Sterling. It was a useless, indulgent emotion. He had to be strong. He had to endure. But as the days ticked by, the hope that had been a flickering candle flame dwindled to a barely glowing ember. He started cleaning, packing. Not because he was giving up, but because it was the only thing he could control. He carefully wiped down each tool, wrapping the more delicate instruments in oily rags and placing them in old wooden crates. It was a funereal act, a preparation for the end. He was burying his life piece by piece. The community's indifference was the cruelest cut. He had fixed their cars for decades, often at a discount, sometimes for free if he knew a family was struggling. He had sponsored the Little League team for 10 years straight, his garage's name on the back of their jerseys. Had they all forgotten, or did it simply not matter? In a world that worshipped success, his failure was a contagion they were afraid to catch. It was on one of these bleak afternoons, with only a week left before Sterling's 2-week offer expired, that the sound came. It wasn't the smooth, synthetic purr of a modern engine. It was a ragged, sputtering cough, a deep, thoracic rumble that spoke of age and power and something gone terribly wrong. A motorcycle limped into his driveway, trailing a thin plume of blue smoke, and died with a final metallic gasp right in front of the open bay doors. It was a Harley-Davidson, an old panhead, customized and clearly well-loved, but also road-weary and hurting. The man astride it was as weathered as his machine. He was old, with a face like a topographical map of long, hard roads, and a cascade of white hair and beard that flowed over the collar of his faded leather jacket. He swung a stiff leg over the seat and stood, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had long since lodged a formal protest. He looked at the dead bike, then at Arthur, who had instinctively moved forward, his mechanic's ears having already diagnosed a likely carburetor issue mixed with a possible oil leak. The old rider's eyes, though, were surprisingly clear and sharp. They held no pity, only a quiet assessment. "She gave up the ghost," the old man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, like stones rolling downhill. "Been threatening to for the last 50 miles, Arthur walked a slow circle around the bike, his eyes taking in the details. The worn leather of the saddlebags, the custom paint job faded by sun and time, the sheer mileage etched into its very being. This wasn't a weekend toy. This was a man's life, his partner. "Looks like you've seen a lot of country together," Arthur said, his hands already itching to get to work. "More than most," the rider replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal nothing but a few crumpled receipts and a single, faded photograph. He sighed. "Looks like I'm running on fumes, same as her. I'm just trying to get to my daughter's place, another 100 miles north. Can you tell me what's wrong?" "I haven't got much to pay with." Arthur's heart, which had felt like a cold, hard stone in his chest for weeks, felt a faint flicker. He saw not a problem, but a purpose. Here was something broken he could actually fix. He looked at the old man's exhausted face, at the empty wallet, and he saw a reflection of his own struggle, his own dwindling resources. He thought of Sterling's sneering face, of the foreclosure notice, of the $2 he couldn't afford for a block of cheese. And then he thought of his father and of Michael. He made a decision. It wasn't logical. It wasn't smart. But it was right. "Let's get her inside," Arthur said, waving a hand toward the empty bay. "No charge." The old rider's eyes narrowed slightly. "No charge? Son, nothing's free. Consider it professional courtesy," Arthur said with a slight, unpracticed smile. One old-timer to another, for the next 2 hours. The silence of the garage was replaced by the familiar, comforting sounds of work. The clink of a wrench, the hiss of a compressed air hose, the soft scrape of metal on metal. Arthur moved with an efficiency and grace that belied his age and his troubles. He rebuilt the carburetor with parts he scavenged from his own dwindling stock, cleaned the spark plugs, and found the source of the oil leak. A cracked gasket he painstakingly replaced with one he had to fabricate himself from a sheet of cork. The old rider sat on an overturned crate, watching in silence, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He didn't speak, but there was a deep, abiding respect in his gaze. When Arthur was finally done, he wiped his hands on a rag and kicked the starter. The panhead roared to life, not with a sputter, but with a deep, thunderous, healthy heartbeat. The sound filled the garage, chasing out the shadows and the silence. It was the most beautiful sound Arthur had heard in months. The old man stood up, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. "She hasn't sounded that good in years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "Just get to your daughter safe," Arthur replied. As the rider prepared to leave, he hesitated. "I have to give you something," He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. "My son made this for me. He was good with his hands, too. It's not much, but it's all I have." Arthur looked at the small bird, its craftsmanship simple but full of love. He thought of Michael. He gently pushed the old man's hand back. "You keep it," he said softly. "You hold on to the things your son made." He scribbled something on a small piece of scrap paper and tucked it into the bike saddlebag. Just in case, the old man looked at him, a profound understanding passing between them. He nodded, swung his leg over the revived Harley, and with a final, grateful look, he rumbled out of the driveway and onto the open road, the sound of his powerful engine fading into the distance. Arthur watched him go, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He had given away his time, his last good parts, and asked for nothing in return. It was, by any measure, a foolish act for a man on the brink of ruin. But as he stood there, listening to the returning silence, he didn't feel foolish. He felt like Arthur Penhaligon again. The act, small and private as it was, did not go entirely unnoticed. Martha, the waitress from the diner across the street, had been on her smoke break, watching the whole exchange from a distance. She had seen the sputtering Harley arrive, had seen the old, broke-looking rider, and had seen him leave 2 hours later with the bike running like new. She had seen that no money changed hands. That evening, the diner was abuzz with the story. "Can you believe it?" Martha said, refilling coffee cups for a table of local farmers. "Arthur's about to lose his shop, and he's out there fixing bikes for free for some old drifter." Tom, the hardware store owner, shook his head. "Poor guy's lost it. Sterling's got him right where he wants him. He's probably just giving up." But another man, a quiet plumber named Dave whose father had been friends with Arthur's, saw it differently. "I don't know," he said, stirring his coffee. "My dad always said Arthur Penhaligon was the most honest man he ever knew. Maybe he just saw a guy who needed help." The conversation spread through the small town like a slow-burning fire. The narrative began to shift subtly at first. The image of Arthur as a failed relic was being challenged by a new one, Arthur as a man of quiet, stubborn principle. People who had pitted him started to feel a prickle of something else, admiration, perhaps, or even shame for their own inaction. They remembered the times he had helped them, the Sunday he'd come out to jump a car for the minister, the time he'd refused payment for fixing a young single mother's brakes, telling her to just pay it forward. These were small kindnesses, long forgotten in the rush of modern life, but now they were being recalled, dusted off, and re-examined. The story of the free repair became a small legend, a counterpoint to the relentless narrative of Sterling's progress. It was a whisper of defiance against the cold logic of profit and loss. People started looking at Arthur differently when he walked down the street. The averted eyes were replaced with hesitant nods. The pity was replaced with a grudging respect. It changed nothing about the foreclosure notice still sitting on his workbench, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a little less alone. He didn't know about the whispers, of course. He was too consumed by the impending doom. He spent the next 2 days in a haze of quiet despair, the brief moment of peace after the rider's departure having evaporated under the harsh reality of his situation. The deadline loomed, a black hole threatening to swallow his entire world. He was down to his last few dollars, his pantry nearly bare. The end was no longer an abstract threat. It was a certainty. He had failed. He had broken his promise to Eleanor. The thought was a constant, crushing weight. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and overcast, the sky threatening a storm that matched the tempest in Arthur's soul. He was sitting on his stool, staring at the phone, as if willpower alone could make it ring with a miracle. The deadline was tomorrow. Sterling would arrive, smug and victorious, with the sheriff in tow. The thought made him physically ill. Then he heard it. At first, it was a low, distant hum, like a swarm of angry hornets on the horizon. He dismissed it as a passing truck on the highway. But the sound didn't fade. It grew, deepening from a hum to a rumble, then to a ground-shaking, window-rattling roar that seemed to vibrate up through the concrete floor and into his bones. It was the sound of dozens, No, scores of heavy motorcycles, all moving together, a wave of synchronized thunder. Arthur stood up, his heart pounding with a sudden, inexplicable mix of fear and curiosity. He walked to the open bay doors and looked out. The street was empty, but the sound was immense, inescapable, echoing off the buildings. Windows and doors down the block were opening as people came out to see what was happening. Martha stood frozen on the steps of the diner, a coffee pot still in her hand. Tom came out of his hardware store, shielding his eyes. Then they appeared. Cresting the small hill at the edge of town was a phalanx of headlights, a rolling tide of chrome and black leather. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, 2 by 2, a river of steel that flowed into Havenwood's quiet main street. At the front of the procession was a massive Harley, flanked by others that were just as intimidating. They weren't just bikers. The patches on their vests were unmistakable, even from a distance. The winged Death's Head, Hell's Angels. The town held its breath. This wasn't a casual weekend ride. This was an arrival. This was a statement. The lead bike slowed, and the entire column of over 80 motorcycles followed suit, the roar of their engines dropping to a menacing, synchronized idle. They filled the street from curb to curb, a formidable, intimidating wall of power. They stopped directly in front of Penhaligon and Son. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, nothing happened. The bikers just sat there, their engines a low, threatening growl. The collective gaze of 80 men hidden behind sunglasses and hardened expressions fixed on the small, unassuming garage. The townspeople were paralyzed. Fear was a palpable thing in the air. This was the kind of trouble that small towns like Havenwood only saw in movies. Arthur stood in the doorway, his knuckles white as he gripped the frame. He wasn't scared. He was too tired, too beaten down for fear. He was just bewildered. He searched his memory for any reason they would be here. An angry customer? A misunderstanding? He came up with nothing. The engines cut out, one by one, in a staggered, percussive sequence. The thunderous roar was replaced by an even more intimidating silence. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the nervous rustle of the wind. Then, with a unified creak of leather, the bikers dismounted. They were large men, most of them, hardened by the road and by a life Arthur could only imagine. They didn't speak. They simply stood by their machines, a silent army flanking the street, their presence a physical pressure. One man detached himself from the front of the pack and began to walk toward the garage. He was huge, with a barrel chest and arms covered in intricate tattoos. His leather vest, or cut, was adorned with patches that told a story of rank and territory. A patch on his chest read Sledge. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, his boots heavy on the asphalt. He stopped a few feet from Arthur. He took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were intelligent and incredibly intense. He looked past Arthur, his gaze sweeping over the clean, orderly tools on the walls, the half-finished Indian chief, the faded sign above the door. Finally, his eyes came to rest on Arthur's face. Arthur met his gaze, his back straight. He had nothing left to lose. "I'm Arthur Penhaligon," he said, his voice steady. "This is my shop." The big man, Sledge, nodded slowly. "We know who you are." Sledge's voice was a low baritone, calm but carrying an undeniable authority. He held Arthur's gaze for a moment longer before speaking again. "A few days ago you helped a rider, an old man on a panhead." Arthur nodded, his mind racing. "I remember him. His bike broke down. His name was Hemlock," Sledge said, a note of deep reverence in his tone. "He was our president, our founder. He was a brother, a father, a legend to all of us." The words hung in the air, heavy and significant. The 80 silent bikers standing on the street were not a threat. They were mourners. Sledge continued, his voice softening slightly. "He had cancer. The doctors gave him a month. He said he didn't want to die in a hospital bed. He wanted to go on one last ride to see the ocean. He was on his way back from that ride when his bike gave out. A wave of understanding washed over Arthur. He remembered the old man's tired eyes, his quiet dignity. Sledge reached into his own vest and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was the scrap note Arthur had tucked into the saddlebag. He unfolded it carefully. "Hemlock made it to his daughter's house," Sledge said. "He passed away in his sleep 2 days ago. When we went through his things, we found this." In his saddlebag, Sledge held up the note. He didn't read it aloud to the town, but he turned it so Arthur could see his own hurried scrawl. "Payment enough to see an old warrior ride on." "He also had this," Sledge said, pulling out the small, carved wooden bird. "He told his daughter about the mechanic who fixed his bike for free. The man who saw the bird his son had made and told him to keep it, because you understood what it meant to hold on to something a son had made." Sledge's intense eyes seemed to look right through Arthur, seeing all the years of quiet grief and unspoken loss. "Hemlock told her you were a good man, an honorable man. He said you reminded him of the way things used to be." The truth of the situation began to settle over the onlookers. The whispers turned from fearful to awestruck. This wasn't an invasion. It was a pilgrimage. Sledge took a step closer. "Our brotherhood has a code. We repay our debts, and we honor those who show respect to our own. You showed our president kindness and dignity in his final days. You gave him the gift of completing his last ride. That is a debt that gold cannot repay. But we're going to try." Just then, a gleaming black sedan pulled up, screeching to a halt behind the wall of motorcycles. Mr. Sterling jumped out, his face livid with rage. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered, striding toward the garage. "You people are blocking my property. I want you gone now. This man is being evicted tomorrow." Sledge didn't even turn his head. 2 of the largest bikers silently moved to intercept Sterling, planting themselves in his path. They didn't touch him. They didn't have to. They just stood there, 2 mountains of leather and muscle, their expressions blank. Sterling stopped dead, his bravado evaporating in the face of their silent, immovable presence. He stammered, took a step back, and his eyes darted around, looking for a police officer, for any authority figure. But there was no one. There was only the quiet authority of the Brotherhood. Sledge finally turned his head slowly toward Sterling. "You're the landlord?" Sterling puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. "I am, and I'll have you all arrested for trespassing." Sledge walked over to him, his sheer size eclipsing the smaller man. "How much does he owe you?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Sterling, emboldened by the topic of money, sneered. "More than you and your vagrant friends could ever scrape together. It's a matter of $24,000 in back rent and penalties." Without a word, Sledge reached into his vest and pulled out a thick envelope. He tossed it onto the hood of Sterling's car. "There's $30,000 in there," he said flatly. "The extra 6 is for you to get your car detailed and to forget this address. You will draw up a bill of sale right now for this entire property. Title free and clear to Arthur Penhaligon. Or we can discuss it further. Your choice." Sterling stared at the envelope, then at the faces of the 80 bikers staring back at him, and the last of his fight drained away. He scrambled to his car, pulled out a pen and papers, and with trembling hands, began to write. While Sterling scribbled furiously, his face pale with fear and greed, Sledge turned his attention back to Arthur. The bikers, as if on a silent cue, began to move. But they weren't getting on their bikes to leave. They were moving toward the garage and they were carrying tools. One man, with sparks stitched on his vest, carried a professional electrician's tool belt. Another, with hands as big as dinner plates and a patch that read brick, began examining the crumbling mortar of the front wall. A truck that had been at the rear of the column pulled up, and men started unloading lumber, cans of paint, new windows, and roofing shingles. Sledge put a heavy, gentle hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Hemlock said your shop was like him," he said. "Old, proud, but in need of a little help. We're a brotherhood, Mr. Penhaligon. We fix things, we build things, and we protect our own." Arthur was speechless. He watched, stunned, as his garage was swarmed by a disciplined, efficient crew. The broken window was carefully removed and replaced. A team of men scrambled onto the roof, tearing off the old, leaky shingles. The roar of a power washer filled the air as years of grime were blasted from the brick facade. The faded Penhaligon and Sun sign was carefully taken down, not to be discarded, but handed to a man with a case of artist's brushes, who immediately set to work restoring it. Inside, Sparks and his crew were tearing out the ancient, frayed wiring, replacing it with new, safe conduit. The dripping faucet was silenced with the turn of a wrench and the application of a new washer. The entire garage was being reborn, resurrected by this army of unlikely angels. The townspeople watched in stunned silence. Their perception of these men, and of Arthur, was being irrevocably transformed. This wasn't a gang of violent outlaws. It was a force of nature, a brotherhood bound by a code of honor so profound it was almost biblical. They were rewarding a simple act of kindness with an avalanche of loyalty. Arthur, overwhelmed, simply stood and watched, tears finally tracking clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He wasn't losing his home. He was gaining a family. By late afternoon, Sterling had delivered the signed and notarized deed, taking his money and scurrying away without a backward glance. The garage was transformed. A new roof sat securely overhead. The windows gleamed. A fresh coat of deep red paint covered the walls, and the restored Penhaligon and Sun sign hung proudly above the door, its gold leaf lettering shining in the afternoon sun. The bikers had even tuned up his old Indian chief, its chrome polished to a blinding sheen. Sledge approached Arthur, holding something in his hands. It was a brand-new, black leather vest, identical to the ones the bikers wore, but with one difference. It had no club patches, no rank insignia. Instead, on the back, was a beautifully airbrushed image of a panhead motorcycle riding into a sunset. And above it, in simple, elegant script, were the words, "The mechanic, this is from us," Sledge said, handing the heavy vest to Arthur. "You're not one of us. You're a friend, an ally, and anyone who comes through this town will know that this garage, and the man inside it, are under the protection of our club. No one will ever trouble you again." Arthur took the vest, the leather soft and smelling of newness and respect. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, his throat tight with an emotion too vast for words. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the transformed street. The work was done. The bikers began to pack up their tools, their movements still economical and precise. A quiet orderliness returned. The roar of the power washer was replaced by the low murmur of men sharing a quiet word, a nod of a job well done. Arthur stood in the doorway of his new garage, the heavy leather vest draped over his arm. The air no longer smelled of decay. It smelled of fresh paint, new wood, and the faint, clean scent of ozone from the new wiring. The silence that returned was not the oppressive, lonely quiet of before. It was a peaceful silence, filled with the hum of a new refrigerator one of the bikers had installed in his small office, stocked with more food than he'd seen in a year. The bikers began to mount their machines, the creak of leather a final chorus. Sledge walked over to Arthur for the last time. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he gave a slight, formal bow of his head, a gesture of profound respect that seemed to carry the weight of all 80 men behind him. "You ever need anything, Arthur?" he said, his voice low. "You know who to call." Then he turned, swung his leg over his massive bike, and with a flick of his wrist, the engine exploded into its thunderous rhythm. One by one, the other engines followed suit, the sound rising again into a deafening, glorious roar. It wasn't a sound of menace anymore. To Arthur, and to the entire town of Havenwood, it was the sound of loyalty, of honor, of a debt paid in full. The column of motorcycles pulled out, their taillights a string of red jewels disappearing over the hill they had crested that morning. The ground trembled, and then, slowly, the thunder faded back into a rumble, then a hum, and then, finally, silence. Arthur stood in the quiet, the last echoes of the engines ringing in his ears. He looked at his garage, his home, saved and reborn. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, who were now looking at him not with pity, but with a deep, newfound respect. Mrs. Gable from the bakery gave him a wide, genuine smile and a wave. Henderson, the insurance agent, stood by his car, looking humbled and ashamed. Arthur had not been saved by a bank loan or a government program. He had been saved by a simple act of human decency, a kindness that had rippled outward and returned to him 100-fold. He slipped his arms into the leather vest. Fit perfectly. He ran his hand over the smooth, cool leather, feeling the weight of it on his shoulders. It was a shield. It was a symbol. It was a promise. He was no longer a relic. He was no longer invisible. He was the mechanic, a friend to the brotherhood, a fixture of his town. His dignity restored not by money, but by an honor he had earned with nothing more than his own 2 hands and the goodness of his heart. He took a deep breath of the cool evening air, turned, and walked back into his garage, the new lights gleaming on the polished tools that were, and always would be, ready for the next person in need. The doors to Penhaligon and Son were open, and they would stay that way.